Thanks everybody for making the time today to come to our next installment in Sudo Talks webinar series. These sessions are, for Mac admins by us in the Apple space. We eat, sleep, and breathe Apple. I know I've slept, and breathed this feature for the last several months, and we're excited to share the information and all the ins and outs of it today with you. And this is a monthly series that will be running. So there's other Sudo Talks that will be coming next month and the month after that. So please stay tuned to that. So let's get into it. My name is Bryce Carlson. I'm a product manager here at Addigy, and I'm joined today by Travis, who is a senior solutions architect here at Addigy.
Thanks for coming in, everybody.
And today, Travis and I will be talking about Microsoft Conditional Access for macOS and how that feature has evolved and how that can be best used. So kind of what we'll go through first is just a high-level introduction to Microsoft Conditional Access. If you're not familiar with it, probably are, but we'll just do one slide on that. The types of integrations that are out there, one that is a certificate-only one that you could just deploy using a certificate that you create within Microsoft Defender. And then we'll also talk about the partner API integration that we are just launched now here as well. Then we'll get really in depth on the partner API integration, how that's set up, what the compliance engine actually calculates and how that is sent to Microsoft, and then what are the different components that make up that integration and how it works. And then we'll go through a number of different scenarios actually outlining on an end user device with the different workflows that take place to get you to either if it's registered or not, compliant or not, et cetera, and what that looks like. And then we'll open it up to question and answer. All right, so the just high level conditional access is basically if you are trusted and you're on a trusted device, you have access to organization data. What that means in the Microsoft world is that Microsoft Conditional Access is allowing for your trusted Azure AD users on those registered devices to have organizational data access. What that means for the Addigy and Microsoft integration is that those Microsoft Conditional Access trusted users are on a trusted, enrolled, and managed device that Addigy is managing, but is registered with Azure AD. And as a result, they can then get access to the content. So the two types of integration, and I'm going to put these links in case you don't want to use QR codes or the short URLs. Let me put these in chat here real quick. This is to everyone. So there you go. You should have those in the webinar chat. Those are the full links for both of these integrations, as well as also another link from a blog post and more about the compliance engine that Travis is going to be talking about in a few slides here. The two different types of integration are the certificate, which the certificate integration is kind of just deploying the certificate to the device. And then if that certificate is on the device, that is the trust, so to say. And that when that certificate is presented at authentication, that, yep, that device is trusted. If that certificate's been deployed to the device, we know that it's in a state that X, Y, and Z would have been checked. Therefore, it must be trusted. You get access. For the partner API, it goes a little bit deeper than that. The certificate's kind of like the Diet Coke, and the partner API is like the full sugar Coke. The partner API is using a closed partner API to submit a flag of yes or no of the calculated compliance state that we as the partner Addigy are calculating on device. And then that is sent over to the Microsoft API endpoint, and then that is reflected for the Azure AD registered record of the device. Not that the device is enrolled within Azure AD or Microsoft Intune or Endpoint Manager, but that it's just registered and it's reflecting the state that we have as a partner, where we have the device actually enrolled and managed. That certificate is put in the login keychain, and that is presented at the Azure AD login. All right, so visual, kind of just to delineate what that's looking like is the certificate, the workplace join key that's being put into the login keychain is being provided by company portal when the device is going through that registration only workflow, which you'll see in a little bit. And then Addigy is putting down the configuration profiles and managed binary and basically saying this device is enrolled, owned, and managed so that the device is, file vault encrypted, et cetera, any of the things that are being pushed down that way. The certificate integration is taking that certificate that we're getting from Defender for Cloud Apps, putting that into the profile or maybe a package, however you want to deploy that down to the device to get it there for the authentication. And then that's what's being presented later. So real quick, this is all in those links that I put in the chat there, but the certificate only integration, you're going into Defender for Cloud Apps, you're making a root certificate, and you're going and standing up a conditional access policy with app control, and you're saying that I want to tie that to my Defender for cloud connected apps. And then that policy is actually what's blocking it. It's looking for that certificate to be present. That's what's controlling the access to the content on the device then when that browser session takes place. The API integration. So there's a lot more nuance to this because there's a lot of different moving parts because a lot of different things are synchronizing. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Travis and we'll talk about the compliance engine, how those rules and benchmarks are created on the device and how that is calculated. Then I'll get into the API connection and permissions itself, what you're setting up on the back end with the enterprise application. We'll go over what you have on the device then with self-service, the single sign-on extension, and the company portal app. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Travis, on the compliance engine.
Thank you, Bryce. So compliance engine is something new you may have seen, you may not have seen, kind of depending on if you've seen a couple of those little blue in-app notifications pop or kind of been hounding through some of our blog posts. But in essence, what compliance engine does is it allows you to set benchmarks. Now, some of these, like you'll see in the UI here, we actually pre-populate a series of benchmarks within this. So we have CIS level 1 compliance for both macOS version 12, Monterey, and then also with macOS major version 13, macOS Ventura, the newest one. And we also have the same for NIST guidelines, right? So these are pre-populated benchmarks. And really what we mean by this is it's criteria, right? Think of these in some ways kind of similar to monitoring items, right? In the fact that we're checking normally device fact data on the machine. And what we're looking for is, does the device comply with these rules? A benchmark is comprised of a bunch of individual rules that are looking for things like, it could be anything, but in a lot of these, especially your kind of more ingrained security frameworks, going to be things like, is file vault active on the machine? Is the disk encrypted? Is gatekeeper active, right? So it's a way for you to basically give a whole list of criteria that a device has to match up against and has to satisfy in order to then be in a compliant state, right? So that is really kind of truncated version of like compliance engine, what it is. We're going to explore a little bit more kind of on what it does. But the big reason for that is compliance engine is actually what's feeding back our yes or no, is this device compliant status to Microsoft as part of this integration. So this is, if you want to use it, you've got to get familiar kind of with compliance engine as well. So. Yeah. And this is just an example of kind of within a benchmark, what are we doing here? This is an example of a really simple benchmark, right? This is macOS, in this case, macOS version 10, right? For here, any flavor of macOS 10 that we've got, obviously you'd set this to whatever you're looking for. Well, in this case, we only have one rule, which is firewall enabled. Now, again, a benchmark can have multiple rules. And because of the flexibility that's offered with Addigy being able to apply not just all of our own default device facts, but also custom facts. If there are data points we don't natively monitor, for example, we may not report back if a particular antivirus is installed, right? It'll show in the applications list, but it's not documented as a default device fact where we can very easily assign that as a benchmark. But with custom facts, you can use those to create these unique benchmarks that to suit really kind of whatever the case is. You can also apply multiple benchmarks, so multiple stacks of rules can be applied to devices as well, and they have to comply with all of those rules in each of those individual stacks of benchmarks there, or each stack of rules that comprise those benchmarks. The device has to comply with all of those in order to be compliant. Right, which we're going to see later is what's going to feed back into Microsoft and tell us, yes, we're compliant, we have conditional access, or no, we do not allow the access. So this is, again, not just an opportunity. Another thing that I'd encourage, this is obviously very focused, and most of what we're going to talk about today is going to be on how this feeds into our conditional access with Microsoft. But Compliance Engine is also a great tool, even if you're not necessarily feeding into conditional access, because it gives you a way to, at a glance, figure out if devices are matching up with any security policies or things that you've got set up. So even if you're not here so much for the Microsoft, Compliance Engine also is something else that you want to check out too. Good. So this is, again, just kind of the individual view, what it looks like whenever we're setting these things up here. So if I wanted to create an individual rule, remember benchmarks are comprised of rules. So your fundamental building block is your rule. This is the rule. Normally, again, that's going to be this device fact. Yes or no. Is file vault active? Yes or no. What's going on there? And cool part about the Compliance Engine is, much like our monitoring alerts, and why I mentioned this at the beginning, we also have the ability to deploy remediation scripts as a part of this workflow. So in this case, one of the things we have is we have this fact for, is the MDM client stuck? And if you saw kind of our newsletter that went out the last week or so, this is a fact that we've kind of built ourselves as a way to augment and give a little more visibility into MDM communication to make sure devices are still operating like they should. They're still contacting that MDM server. So this is a fact that is available for you. If it's not already in your environment, you should be able to grab it from the community, although I think it's pre-populated for everybody now. And then we can assign a remediation script, and that script is available in the community section in that scripts tab. So again, much like your monitoring remediation, in this case with the benchmarks, if you apply your rules, they have remediation applied to them. We apply that benchmark that rule is a part of to a policy. If a device is non-compliant for any of those individual rules, it's non-compliant in totality, right? We have to comply with the totality of the benchmark in order to be in our compliant state. So we can assign remediation scripts to say, okay, hey, if this device isn't compliant for this rule, run this instruction Addigy, try and get that problem solved for me. And that way we can actually automate the compliance of that device. We can notify you, obviously, that it's not compliant. We can also help you get it into that compliant state. And obviously that's going to make it nice and easy whenever we start trying to integrate with Microsoft here.
Yeah, and one thing to keep in mind with that too, I was doing a little bit of Q&A answering while you're talking there. One of the questions that we have right now, I'll answer live kind of to go with this, because it's really relevant. Bob's question about Malwarebytes and third-party firewalls. You could write any custom fact here that you'd be pulling that in, and you're looking for that value. So you could say, if in this case, Malwarebytes or any other component, you can read that back, you could have that be a custom fact that you're saying, oh, okay, this firewall is on. That would also be part of the compliance rule and then benchmark here. On top of that, the remediation there, if it's something like firewall or any of the other components that you would actually have control over through a script, you could actually go through and say, okay, great, this got turned off, turn it back on. And as we'll see later when we get into the data synchronization with Microsoft and how the state is just a yes or no, if you can maybe get that remediated before it would synchronize up or even very shortly thereafter, that end user might not notice that they became non-compliant if maybe they, for some reason, had access to turn off the firewall or whatever it may be that you're then scripting. The minute it sees that, it runs that audit, it's going to see that. It's also going to go and try and fix that right away. That way, hopefully, the end user would be none the wiser that the device, through their own actions or whatever took place, became non-compliant, because it then become compliant again immediately once that automation runs effectively. Okay. Oh, yep. And then here's the example we were talking about with.
Yep. Exactly. So this is to kind of tying it all together, and again, pointing back towards the main focus of today, which is Microsoft and conditional access. This is essentially what it's going to look like in the case where you have a device that is non-compliant, right? It does not satisfy all of the rules and all of the benchmarks that are applied to it. So what you'll see is if you go into the Go Live page, there's also just a default fact. I think it's called is compliant. If you want to look for it in the main devices page and create a table view there. But if you're in the Go Live page, you'll see this right underneath the MDM status for your device that you've got. And what Microsoft sees whenever we go to look in the Microsoft portal, whenever we're talking about this integration, is just a Boolean yes or no. Is the device compliant? Yes. Okay, awesome. If it isn't, no access. Right. So this is where, in terms of how does Microsoft know what is it getting, as part of this new integration we've built out, it is this compliance status. Again, this is why the compliance engine is the foundation really for what we're doing with this conditional access integration.
Absolutely. And one of the other questions I had kind of answered when we were talking earlier, how often does that synchronize? Well, as soon as this is updated, it gets sent up there to Microsoft very shortly thereafter. 30 to 90 seconds is kind of when that's reflected there, because we're basically seeing it per device and then updating per device there. So thank you, Trev. What that then means is, how do we get that connected? Well, if you go into Microsoft Endpoint, which is where the integration is taking place, that's what's actually going to give you the permissions to connect us as a partner and have the MDM communicating in that synchronization way that we were just talking about. So if I go into tenant administration, connectors and tokens, I will see a blade called Partner Compliance Management under cross-platform. If I go and click on that, that's going to say, okay, I want to go make a new partner. So I would go through, and again, more of that's in the KB link that's in the chat there, and then the QR codes, and I'll be showing those QR codes and the links again at the end of the slide deck as well if you've joined in between there. What's happening effectively is you're giving the partner the right to add devices as registration devices only, not enrolled, registered through that partner, saying this platform and then these users. One thing that's important to keep in mind of that is that you're feeding the partner integration a group ID of your users. That could be your Mac users, maybe it's all Apple users, maybe it's a dynamic group that's based off of a piece of the organization that has to have conditional access turned on. And so that group ID is a component that you're feeding the partner compliance blade within Microsoft, and then you're also inputting that when you make the connection within Addigy in your account integrations third-party add-ons section. Because what you're saying is these are the end users that Microsoft needs to earmark for sending them to this partner. And what that means there is, let's say you have a personal iMac at home, the end user has, and they also have a MacBook Pro that they get from work. When they go and sign in on either of those, let's say that they're both fresh devices, the only thing that Microsoft knows is the end user, that user principal name, the UPN that you're feeding to Microsoft. That's the only component that it knows at that point, because the device in both scenarios, whether it be the home or the corporate device, is not enrolled. So it doesn't know what that device ID is, because that certificate that we're creating and sending at the sign-in doesn't exist. So what's important to know is you have that group of users. Those are the ones that are going to be judged against this partner compliance integration. And that's just how it's configured within the Microsoft portal itself. And so that piece of data being the UPN, the first thing that you send along, that's how it knows how to route. In a few slides here, we'll get into a flow chart kind of explaining what route that would take, because there is still a path if the end user has a corporate owned Mac and a personal owned Mac to get their personal Mac in, because obviously it's going to be providing a certificate a different way then versus the integration and how it's registered here. But just one thing of note in this part, to make sure that you're cognizant of what that group is when you're doing that. So once you've turned on that part of the integration, when you go through and you click connect on that, and you're actually going and hitting the save button for that, effectively putting that in, that's going to send you to an admin consent page. So you'll be using your global domain or application administrator Azure AD account. That's going to go and make that enterprise application. So that's pulling from Microsoft's list of partners. We're going to be adding the Addigy compliance application, and it's getting basically user.read privileges so that it can verify that. And then also it's getting the submission to the endpoint privileges that then is what's internally to Microsoft updating that flag of yes or no for the device. So once that's all connected, you can then actually go and take action on the device itself and go and register it. The last components to have ready for that would be in your self-service configuration within Addigy. You'll go and check a box, and that's basically what's going to make that policies self-service configuration get this lovely red large register button that you get that's going to go through and actually do the workflow that we're looking at in just a moment here. Another thing to keep in mind is the example you're going to see does not have this turned on, just so that we can break it down a little bit more and you can kind of see more of what's actually happening on device. But the single sign-on extension from Microsoft would suppress any of the extra logins, or let's say that maybe part of your workflow before you flip on conditional access, maybe you move end users as part of your onboarding to a different dynamic group once they've done HR training, gives them more access, however that may be. I've seen a lot of different ways that organizations have done that. That if they've already signed in to any other apps, if the single sign-on extension is present, they won't get the prompts as such that you're going to see in just a moment here, because they'll already have that cached Microsoft single sign-on that's on device and ready. And so the last component then is the company portal app. So as part of this integration, it may not make much sense, but it is kind of how it has to function because of how Microsoft is doing that workplace join. But company portal is put down to the device. We're putting it in as part of the device enrollment when that is enabled for the integration, so that you don't have to manage that. And then we're also auto configuring the auto update for it just by recommendation of Microsoft. There's a lot of different nuances to how the registration takes place and how it's using the MCell Microsoft Authentication library. And having the latest version is very important to make sure that we're having the certificate and everything created with all the ACLs properly. So on the back end, that's being configured that company portal is there, hidden away, not visible to the user in Launchpad, not to confuse them. And it's only called upon when we're going and doing that registration that is effectively opening it, doing that sign in, and then we get the certificate that's needed, and then it closes and you're back to just having Mac managed on the screen present there. So what does that look like to the end user? So here's a video of what that looks like. So you'll have Mac managed up. The end user would go ahead and they'd click on registered device. That's going to say, your device isn't registered. Please continue through the on-screen prompts. That will call company portal in registration only mode. Very important there. It's a specific flag that we're calling within company portal binary within the app package. So it's not going to do an enrollment. It's going to do a registration only. So then I'll go through. I'll put in my credentials. Again, single sign-on is not present here, just to show the different processes of how this is going through. Once I sign in, what's going to happen on the back end on the Azure AD side is it's going to generate a device ID for this device and then put on this device in this user session in the login keychain that device workplace join certificate. And so once that certificate's in place, then that's what's going to be presented when we open the browser or the Microsoft desktop apps later. That would then go through and say, this is, Travis's device. And this is how we know that, because it's this user account. So now it's pulled onto the second sign in here, which again would be suppressed with the single sign-on extension because I already had signed in once. You get confetti and you're all done. What that second sign-in is doing is effectively just going and pulling down for the Addigy binary what that device ID is, the user ID from Azure. So we know this is, in this case, Travis's device, registered, et cetera.
Yeah, and then to expand on that, kind of like we mentioned before, that's what then from that point, if you were using the extensible SSO payload, once that sync has been done by that user, the extensible SSO payload will then be able to pass their credentials for logging in nice and easy to all of those Office apps, right? Whatever gets listed as part of that extensible SSO payload. And if this is the first time that you guys are hearing about extensible SSO, because it is still fairly new out there, I think Apple only built it kind of part of like WWDC last year. When this sort of came out in the wild. I'm going to drop a handy little article from Apple, just going over kind of what it is, but essentially it is passing login credentials for various apps, just to make that process nice and easy. And when you start tying in with something like, the conditional access with Addigy identity even, that just makes it so you can offer a really nice login experience to the end user as well.
Yeah, and how I've seen a lot of organizations handle that is they'll either make this their very first step with that new user or a new hire orientation onboarding effectively, that they go through, they get this, they get their identity, boom, okay, great. Now, any Microsoft app you open from this point forward, it's already going to be signed in and you're already going to be registered and compliant. So just starting them from that good starting point effectively. Okay. Oh, resend the link to everyone. I did that before too. We put the hosts and panelists there. I did it
Thank you,
myself
Bryce.
too before. Okay, so once that registration is complete on device, this is where we get into that synchronization that Travis was talking about earlier. So if I go and look in my devices listing for this device that I had just freshly registered, and I see, okay, I can see that the device is named, I got the version, it's registered, it's not owned by me. One thing of note, it will send Intune, Microsoft Intune as the MDM. That's just how all of these partner devices come in. That's something that we're working with Microsoft for in the future to have that reflect the partner from the app ID. But right now it reflects Intune because Intune is the endpoint that is calculating and taking in that data as part of the integration. Then the compliance state right now, no, because if we look on my device in the screenshot here, I don't have the firewall turned on. Firewall is what I use for testing and all of these, because it's just easy to turn it on, off, and toggle it. And then as soon as the device checks in, or if I go and force an audit at that point, it flips the flag immediately. So for testing, really nice and easy to have that there. Now, if I were to go and flip that back on and do an audit or have the device check in, that's going to go through and the device would then become compliant. Typically, I've seen it anywhere from 30 to 90 seconds, depending on time of day and load on Azure side, but it refreshes it quite quickly from when that goes through. And as far as when we're marshaling and sending that out to the API, that's happening immediately after we get an audit and we flip that flag within our database there. So what does that look like for a device that's non-compliant or not registered? We'll go through a few of those now. So if you're looking on device and we're going to go to office.com and we want to go ahead and sign in, I go click on sign in. This device is registered but not compliant, and it does not have the single sign-on extension, and I have not signed in. I cleared the sign-in session effectively just so that we're getting this as if nothing had been signed in previously. What would the end user see? But the device is registered. First thing they're going to see is Microsoft is requesting for a certificate. And we can see, here, that's the MS organization access. That's the workplace join key. So that's actually my device ID of that. If I click continue, it's going to say, well, we want to provide that. They're going to ask for the keychain password to allow that. Hit always allow. The user won't be prompted after that point then. Even if they have a password change on the Azure side, that certificate remains the same throughout the life cycle of it. Even if the user changes passwords and all that, that certificate is just maintained as that's the device ID for this user principal name on this device. So if they do this once, they're not going to see that again after that, if that's the same device ID and certificate that remains on the device for its life. If for some reason the keychain is deleted, then yes, they would have to get that prompt again. So I go through, I say, yes, allow that. Well, what happens? Well, okay, so we know that the device sent that certificate. We can see here, if we click on the more details of that, that we see this device is in a managed state. That's the device identifier. That's what came through there. So, okay, that device should be registered and everything is good to go. But we know that the firewall is not on. So what's going to happen is it's going to tell us we need to do an action to get access to this resource. If I click on open, it's actually going to open a URL and then bounce it to self-service on the device to show the end user where they're not compliant. Microsoft basically, through this integration, allows for a URL redirection. And then what we've taken with that, as you'll see in a couple slides here, is a flow chart effectively of the different paths the user can take based off of the state that they're in, so that we're covering corporate-owned, not registered, corporate-owned, registered, personal, registered, not compliant, all those different states, so that it can flow to the most user-friendly, user-facing screen for them. So that's a device that was registered and non-compliant. It's just going to bring them to self-service to show them that, so that they know, okay, this might be why I'm not compliant. I turned this off, XYZ. In the case of the device not being registered, we'll get the same screen when we go to log in to microsoftonline.com for office.com. And again, if we open the more details, now we'll see, well, this device is in an unregistered state. So I go ahead, click continue. What it's going to do now, because it knows that it doesn't have that registration, is it's going to bounce you to this multiple, two choice page effectively, where the end user will be asked, is this a company-owned device or a personal device? Because what I talked about earlier with the user group and the scoping of this within the endpoint compliance partner blade, that's the first thing it's getting. So if I went to sign in as me, as an unregistered example, the first thing that Azure knows is that it's me, but it doesn't know anything else because it doesn't have a certificate. Nothing else was presented. So because I'm me and I'm part of the partner integration, the first thing I'm going to be routed to then, if I don't have any other information that's being passed, is the question of, do I own this device or is it personal? If it's a company-owned device, the first thing that we're going to attempt is to bounce it to self-service and say, this device is not registered. It's effectively going to automatically click that button for them when it launches self-service and put it into that registration like you just saw in that video, so that the end user would go through that process. And of course, if the single sign-on extension is in place and they're going into a browser session where they've already signed in, it's going to just kind of run them through that process very quickly and get them registered then. If it's a personal device, it's going to dump them to the Go link from Microsoft to enroll them as a personal device so that they can get access that way. Just because obviously, maybe you have personal devices that to get in, they need access to maybe just Outlook. You give them access. If it's a personal device, you'll give them access to only Outlook web access, office.com maybe. You could have a path for that there then with a different conditional access policy that is less restrictive for maybe just Office. And you'd say, I'll require the device to be marked compliant, but that conditional access policy is slightly different, however you want to do that. If for some reason there is not self-service on the company-owned device, maybe the end user went out and bought a device, just trying to cover any of the edge cases here. Maybe it's, I used to come from the EDU space. Professor goes out and buys something with grant money. It's owned by the college, but it's not actually. It gets kind of in that weird state. What would happen if they click on company owned and there isn't self-service present, device is not Addigy enrolled? It's actually going to pull them to the optional URL that you would have set up when you made the connection for the integration. So in the initial setup of the partner API connection, there's a third text box that's basically saying, give me a URL. That could be any custom URL you have. In the example, actually, a few slides before, I just used a knowledge base article from my university. I was a Mac admin a while back, just a KB link. You could point it to anything that you have there. Maybe it's a directions for onboarding a device to enroll it, or who they need to contact for that. Just giving the end user more context there. And again, personal is still going to go to personal there. So I feel like Charlie from Always Sunny talking about Pepe Sylvia, but with my flow chart here, again, what that is kind of just to relay the sign in when the device fails, whether that be non-compliant, whether it be not registered, etc. It's going to get that sign in screen from login at microsoftonline.com. If we know the device ID and we know that it was registered, it's just going to basically fast lane it straight to self-service to show the end user why or why not is that device compliant. If we don't have an ID, it's not registered, it's going to take it to the multiple choice page, basically saying, okay, is this company owned? If it's company owned and we have self-service, great, route it to self-service then, get them registered, get them in, get them access. If it's company owned, but they don't have self-service on the device, then dump it to the custom URL, give them more context, maybe a directions page, just to give the end user some idea of what their next step is. If it's personal, bring it out to the Go link for Microsoft's KB of enrolling it with company portal for those personal devices if they're not going to be within Addigy there. So frequently asked questions before we get into the questions there. Is it possible to automate that process for the device registration that you saw within company portal and through Addigy self-service? No, because that end user needs to provide that. The single sign-on, extensible single sign-on will help with that. But the end user needs to be the one to do that because that is your point of trust for everything there forward. There is no API, no hidden binary command within company portal to automate that using the built-in commands. It needs to call that in that registration only mode and have that interactive sign. Where will a device record live within Azure? So in a few of the slides you saw where I was showing in the devices within Azure AD, it's Azure AD registered. That's where you see it there. You will not see a record within Intune, despite the integration actually flowing through Intune for the partner API and the data send. Personally owned devices, we kind of covered that with the workflow there, but just the point is, again, the only thing that Microsoft knows when you do that first sign-in is the user principal name. So it is going to route it that way if that user is part of the group that's part of the partner integration. When will this support more than one Azure AD tenant into Addigy? That's something we're working on for later this year yet. Right now, it's one-to-one for how the connection takes place. It's part of an enhancement we're working on for the multi-tenancy of having multiple Azure tenants in there. Right now, it's just the one-to-one that exists in there. How can you migrate the devices that are in Intune into that? Well, because you would need to remove the MDM certificate to get it out of Intune and into Addigy, that's actually going to be a process that would remove the original workplace join that we were looking at. So you're gonna have to re-register it anyway as part of that workflow, just because of how the removal happens from the Intune side if you were migrating those that direction. Same concept if you were migrating them out and back, the workplace join will remain there. It is not removed when the binary is removed, but the device becomes unmanaged. It makes that device ID non-compliant when that's unmanaged. So that way the device ID is deactivated, but it doesn't match up with what you're gonna have when you go and do a Intune enrollment itself. How do you remove the registration from the device? Kind of thing I was just getting at there is the device registration isn't removed when the binary is removed. There isn't a API within Company Portal to automate the removal of that. There's a few scripts that I have out there that for removing the components that it puts down, but the whole point is that it's supposed to be for the life cycle of the device, that device's ID, and that's the certificate you're providing. When does the integration synchronize? So anytime a device audit takes place on device, if anything is changing about the compliance state, that's sent up immediately, like I said, 30 to 90 seconds. Then there is a heartbeat that takes place once a week, basically saying, I'm here, even if I haven't had any updates about any of my devices, I'm here. If I had anything, I would have told you on a per device record. And that's kind of just the API communication that's taking place there. Other questions here? I know we have some in the Q&A I saw come in here.
Yeah, one real quick here, Bryce, is if a user goes to do the registration and their Azure password needs to be updated, right? It's expired, needs to be changed, it doesn't match, the requirements. Is that just a native prompt that's going to pop up in that dialog that says, hey, your Azure password needs to be updated, and it's going to route them to log in and change that way?
Yeah, it's going to be the same way. Like if you were opening office.com, any of those where it's going to route it for, like if you check the box that says make user change password when you make an account, same concept there. Actually, you could, if you wanted to, as part of your new hire orientation, if you're giving them a generic one, you could make it do that during the company portal prompt because it's just going to be getting that initial sign-in. Okay, I'll answer this one live here. So licensing requirements. So to have this, you need to have premium AAD P1, which is what's giving you conditional access, which regardless of however you're going to use conditional access, you have to have that. And then EMS E5 or E3 is what's giving it that per user data submission for, I'm trying to think of the right word for it. That's what's giving you your end user ability to say, this device is owned by this device is registered to on the API, and how that's all flowing through is the EMS E3 or E5. The linked KB article in the top, there's a bulleted list that goes over the requirements. macOS 10.15.0 is minimum macOS requirement. And the other thing you'll need is the global domain or application Azure AD account that's going to let you make that connection when you sit down to turn it on initially. Is it possible to force a sync from Addigy to Intune? Kind of. Again, it happens at any point when the device itself is changing state. So like when I've been testing this or putting together content for this or other trainings, I've just been flipping the flag for the firewall or any of the components of the benchmarks there. And as soon as we calculate a state change of that, it's sent immediately off. That way, it's the most current, most secure for the device of this is the state it's in as of immediately as soon as we know it.
Yeah, and as part of the compliance engine, since that's all device fact driven, those benchmarks should be, if the device goes through an audit, which you can queue anytime. If you want to just do a manual device audit from the go live page for a machine, you can essentially force it to audit all of those device facts, which would then retrigger or should then retrigger that check against those compliance benchmarks to say, hey, are we still good? We updated all the device facts. Let's look through them again and make sure we match those benchmarks. So that's kind of another way you can like sort of, force the sync, so to speak, is perform a manual audit as well.
Yep.
And there's also there's a community fact. If you wanted to do this across multiple devices, I think it's called Start Addigy Agent Audit. So you could just grab a script and run it on, a whole batch of devices to have them all kick off the audit, which would do that same thing there.
Yeah. One of the questions I know we had already touched on, the end user password change. Again, that certificate's going to stay there regardless of their password state. It's just that when they do a password change, their single sign-on session or the session, if they don't have that turned on for whatever app that they first sign into, is going to ask for that new password there. But the integration itself does not need to be rerun if a password change occurs. The registration is a one and done. Once the device is registered, that's what that device's ID is. And as long as the login keychain stays intact, it's not nuked. That's the one scenario I can think of that I've had to work with customers on where the end users will change their password. It's more of if they have an actual AD bound device and they change it and then they can't get into the account and have to reset the login keychain. That would be the one scenario where if you're deleting that keychain where that workplace join key exists, then yes, you would need to rerun the registration. Otherwise, it would just exist as it is. So there's a lot of question here about, there's a lot of interaction for the end user side. The identity and platform SSO and different developments that are taking place now and will probably be talked about at WWDC here in a couple months. That's something that I'm anxiously awaiting on this. The sign-in right now is kind of bound by that single sign-on that takes place once the user session is live. The end goal of kind of where I want to get this to in the future would be is if we can integrate with that platform SSO that Microsoft would have out there, that session could be stored. So it's just that one sign-in, and you could reuse that later through the Microsoft apps. But a lot of that is yet TBD on the Microsoft side there. But yeah, completely automating it doesn't exist today.
Yeah, and then another question around, excuse me, around like compliance and benchmarks is if we have multiple benchmarks assigned to a device, right? Because we can do that. That's totally fine. What happens to all of the rules and all of the benchmarks and need to be compliant and satisfied in order for that to be, in order for that device to be considered compliant, or can it only apply to specific ones? And the answer is if you have compliance benchmarks applied to a device, every rule in every set of benchmarks must be satisfied for that device to be compliant. If one rule out of the 10 that are in one benchmark and there are 2 other benchmarks applied are not compliant, not satisfied, that device is not compliant because it is all of the rules applied to the device that we're looking at there. Good question.
I think I just marked that one as well. I was going through. I think that's one we were just answering.
Yep, that's it.
How does it integrate with ABM, managed Apple IDs, and federated authentication? So the managed Apple ID and federation is kind of interesting with how it works. Effectively, if you have that tied in and you have the federated ID within Azure AD, you still need to provide that in that sign-in session. That being said, again, if once that device has been signed in and that's in that user state, they won't need to provide that. So it doesn't, you can use it independent of that entirely. You don't have to have it federated, but if you do, the user experience is going to be very similar just the same of what it would be if you had the single sign-on extension and a non-federated Azure AD account. Can the devices be listed in Intune? No, that is just a limitation of how the integration functions. It's just that we're submitting it to that Microsoft endpoint, or Microsoft Endpoint Manager endpoint, Intune endpoint, and then that is what's reflecting that into Azure AD. The previous integration, the previous version of the partner API that other MDMs have used did submit a JSON file of 12 different items, and then Microsoft was doing the calculation, and then those were reflected within Intune, but that has been end of life. The new partner API going forward that we're using here does not have the ability to reflect data within Intune, Microsoft Endpoint Manager itself.
Yeah, and as is the case with like a lot of other tools, you could potentially run just like an agent in parallel. So if you wanted to have a record, you could do this. We have folks who do this with us where we're not acting as the MDM, but the Addigy agent is on the machine, and that gives access to all that agent functionality. So if you wanted that, you could potentially just deploy an agent just so that they'd show in, another portal if you wanted more information to be shown there. That's another way that you could go about doing it.
Yeah. Two questions we have here. I'm going to answer them both at the same time of, what's the difference between this integration and using Addigy as your MDM versus using Intune directly as your MDM and having the conditional access that way. The main difference is what it comes down to is the binary. So with Intune as an MDM, you have similar ability to push profiles out through MDM. You have similar functionality for apps and books, VPP, volume purchase program apps. But what Addigy is giving you is a additional ability to control past that with the binary. And for example, like what Travis was talking about with the rules, custom rules and benchmarks, instead of just having those 12 different components of OS version, file vault encrypted, gatekeeper, passcode, I'm forgetting a few, but what the the compliance policy within Intune is, this is just a little bit richer because you could kind of customize script that. You're not going to get the automatic scriptable remediation within Intune with that because that's being done by the Addigy binary. And it just kind of comes down to finding what the best fit for you there is. If you want to have that with the richer agent and MDM experience layered on, that's what this is going to give you versus just using Intune directly for the devices.
And then one more, just kind of we talked about this a little bit, but if you kind of jumping in here towards the end, and the current build of the integration, this is one Azure tenant to one Addigy environment. So as of right now, you can't configure this like with Addigy identity where we can map an Azure tenant to a specific policy. That doesn't exist for conditional access in the right here, right now. It's something we're working on and looking to build towards. So expect to hear more on that as we go.
I also just realized I forgot to launch our, I was joking about it before, but I forgot to launch the poll. I'll launch the poll questions now if you guys want to answer them. If not, a question that James had here about the links. I'm trying to see here. I know you can't copy and paste it. I'll try and resend it, but those links are also, if you go to the KB articles for it, I mean, that's just what it is. If you just search Addigy, compliance, Microsoft, those were the top two hits when I was in a private session the other day. But those are the links again in chat there. Can I go back to the top here? Is there a way we could test this without attaching the entire organization? No, it needs to be attached for the entire organization, but the slide I had, let me go back here actually, with the video, with this here. So when you're in the self-service configuration, that's what's making it visible to the end user. Outside of that, it's not actually taking place on the device there. That's the only component that's going to make that show to the end user itself. And again, that's one of the things that as far as breaking it out per organization, that's an improvement that's coming later this year.
Another question there, Bryce. With this, is this contingent? We have to have Intune licensing specifically in order to leverage conditional access with Microsoft?
The EMS E3 or E5, there's a couple different, the SKUs for Microsoft get a little bit complex, but EMS E3 or E5 is what's giving you that enterprise security to make the record marked as compliant or not when you have that device record. I don't know off the top of my head if that is Intune itself as far as the SKU. I know there's a bunch of different levels of how that gets sliced up, but the bottom line is you're having that premium Azure AD, which is giving you conditional access domain wide or globally within your tenant. And then you also have the EMS E3 or E5, which is what's allowing you to mark a record as compliant or not from that partner integration component. Question about when will the integration be available? So actually, that's a good point to go to this. The KB article kind of goes over where you can turn that on. It's a public beta you can go and enable today. So if you go into your account and the available betas, you should be able to go ahead and enable that right now.
Yeah, and that'll be in the account settings tab for anybody who hasn't seen it before. Within your Addigy tenant, you can actually just pop in and here, let me share my screen here. I can show everybody what
it is. Here, I'll stop here. And that's
perfect.
actually another question someone had about the compliance settings itself. This is actually what Travis is going to pull up right now is the compliance engine. The two features are separate. They're both public betas. You can go and enable. Yep, right here. Mm-hmm. Turning both of those on will give you the visibility until the things we've been talking about today.
Exactly. So and again, for anybody who hasn't gone in there before, you do need, I believe, owner permissions. So your user account in Addigy needs to have owner permissions in order to get to this here. But it's within account and settings in this page here. And there's the compliance engine option, again, to turn that on and make that available. And then the conditional access integration to turn that on as well. And then with compliance, you should then see that pop up here. And again, these are all going to be, these are the pre-configured benchmarks here, and then the ability to add in new ones. So if you're a little confused about kind of where you're expected to see this, and has this gone live yet? Conditional access is live. We've, if you've been with us kind of the last, 8 to 9 months to a year or so, we started adding these as public betas. This is something we've done a lot. We did that with flex policies when we first started releasing that. So we essentially get them to a place where we like where they're at, and we enable a public beta till we get them into a place where we're pretty satisfied with where they are. And then we pull the beta tag off of them, and they're just built into the product normally. But this is where you can go to turn these on in case you wanted to start kind of playing around with compliance and the conditional access stuff here.
Yep. Question that Brent had about the premium license that includes Intune. I do believe that bundle has it there. As long as when you're looking at the thing I'm visualizing in my head, I can't remember where I have the chart, but it shows kind of a matrix of all the different levels of M365 packaging. And the premium one that has the Intune checkbox for that, I do believe includes the EMS and the AAD premium. ETA and compliance remediation. So the compliance remediation within scripts is what we talked about. That's live today. The compliance remediation for things like profiles and scoping those out, that's actively being worked on right now. I'm not 100% sure what the ETA is on that. I'll have to get with the product manager on that. Might be one for follow-up.
Yeah, and then as far as these items leaving the beta, I don't know if we have a hard timeline on that. Again, with us, if something is in the public beta, we're actively kind of soliciting feedback and getting testing on it. I don't know if we have a hard timeline on compliance engine coming out of beta. I know conditional access will probably be there for a little bit, especially because there's still a lot we want to do for it.
Yeah, the goal right now would be to get them out probably before the end of the quarter. But it's one of those things we want to make sure that we're getting enough feedback that we're covering all those edge cases like you saw with that flow chart, making sure that everything's covered there.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see here. One of the questions was about integrating the captive portal and conditional access, how will it affect the user profile path on the Mac? That doesn't impact it. So like even in these devices I was testing with, or you were seeing screenshots with, that just has a local account of, test. It's just purely a local account that has no connection or correlation to Addigy identity or platform SSO and beta, any of that. You can run it independent of that, or you can use an account that has that. All that needs to have is the login keychain, which any account on a Mac is going to have that. Trying to see if there's another. That one I just answered.
And one of the questions, I think there may have been like a little confusion around like Intune and Addigy kind of quote unquote working together. Basically, the only way to get them to show up in one of the portals directly and to have like report all the other device fact information is to have at least the agent from one of the tools. So if you wanted it to report in Intune, you'd need the Intune agent. You could use the Addigy agent as well and Addigy MDM, acting as the MDM provider in that case. But you would still have to have that device enrolled into one of those systems. Normally you just deploy the agent for one and then do either automated device enrollment or your standard manual MDM enrollment for whoever you want to be the arbiter of all the MDM controls.
Yeah. One of the questions we had around the single sign-on extension and file vault. So the single sign-on extension isn't running, so to say, when you're at the login screen. That's a separate session before the user session begins. One of the questions that was asked earlier was about platform SSO and how that's all going to integrate in the future and the changes coming from macOS there. That's kind of more of the holy grail of having that reserved, maintained. I don't know the word I'm looking for. Preserved from that login session all the way through to when they're in the user session. Today, that doesn't integrate there. And as far as file vault, it also does not communicate there. So that's why you'd have those extra sign-ins, because effectively you're unlocking, decrypting the disk, then you're doing a sign-in, and then you're into the end user session where single sign-on extension and these tools actually have access to the login keychain, all those different components. So that's one of those things that's something to keep an eye on coming forward from Apple. Timeline on multi-tenancy, that's something the team is working on right now. I would say, please do reach out to me at product@addigy.com as soon as we get that up and running for a beta for that. Would love to get your feedback and work with you on that one. Oh, we're at time. I think we got through most of them here. Is there anything else you have, Travis?
No, I think that kind of covers it.
Cool. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, everybody, for your time, and have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, and you will get you'll get a follow-up email from us that should have the recording of this as well. But if you want to take a look at this or any of the other webinars, the other sudo talk series that we've done, you can always go to just addigy.com/events. We actually post all of the recordings for those as well. You can go back and look for past events, anything kind of that you're looking for there. We actually just did one about kind of some advanced kind of cool workflows. A little bit of a shameless plug because it was me on that. So if you saw me last time, hello again. But yeah, there's some other really good kind of events and resources that we like to do there as well. Feel free to kind of reach out and submit other ideas. A lot of what we talk about as part of these sudo talk series are driven by you folks, the audience, right? The customers, the people who are looking for us to kind of push things and make the experience better. So let us know what you want to talk about. Obviously, we kind of have some topics planned out, some things we want to look at and discuss, but the major driver of this is what do you all want to hear, what's most beneficial for you. So let us know.
Absolutely. That's what people ask for is what we do the talks on.
Exactly. So with that, I guess we'll let everybody go. Thanks again for hanging out with us. Always good to do these, and keep your eyes peeled.
All right. Thanks, everybody.